good morning, and today also a Sat Sri Akal. Viewers, today we are in the holy land of Amritsar. For many of you, you would be aware, and for all those who are not, Amritsar is blessed to have the Golden Temple. Amritsar is the holy city of the Sikhs. The Golden Temple, also known by the name of Harmandir Sahib, has been there for more than 500 years now and makes the city so very special, not just for the Sikhs, but people from all religions visit this holy land. But why are we bringing this land to you today, viewers, from the Dekho Apna Desh webinar series that we've been running this week for you? We started the journey on the 10th of August, and we will culminate the journey tomorrow, the 15th of August, 2020, when we mark the 74th year of the independence of our great land, India. Today, we are in Amritsar for a very somber and a horrific day that India witnessed in its journey as it was marching to independence against colonial rule. 13th of April, 1919, a day which would have otherwise celebrated Baisakhi. Baisakhi is a festival of harvest. It's a festival of joy. It's a time when farmers rejoice that the Mother Nature has given them the bounty. They go out, have fun in the fairs. They go buy new clothes. But alas, on 13th April 1919, all these people who came to Jallianwala Bagh, a bagh is a garden. They had come there to spend happy time with their families, but they were gunned down. More than 379 people died on that one day. It's a poignant reminder to us viewers on what all went to 15th August 1947, how the entire India, and we started the journey, viewers, on 1857, on 10th of August. We took you to the cellular jail in the Andamans. We went through some unknown and not so celebrated lives of people in Tamil Nadu, Bombay, Calcutta, all over the country. And today, therefore, we are in Jallianwala Bagh because this marked a very different level. And it also showed that the people of the country were pitched against a situation of the kind that was being witnessed. And it is a tribute to all those martyrs, to all those people, to all those souls, children, men, women, old people, younger people, everyone. We stand in salute to them. We owe them everything that we have today. Let's remember them, and let's not forget the duty that is on all of us to carry this beautiful, incredible India forward. Viewers, I would also like to mention at this point that 1919 marked a change in the Indian polity in many ways. And one of the significators of that was that Rabindranath Tagore renounced his knighthood, which had been bestowed upon him by the British due to the incident. Many such things happened. But today, talking and walking us through Jallianwala Bagh is Ms. Kishwar Desai. She is a specialist, and when you hear her, you will know that why she almost needs no introduction. She is doing what she's doing for love of her land, and we call upon all of you to read history, to read the contribution of each Indian that has gone into making this country the great country that it is. But we also want to remind you, do not forget to do your bit as we live today in 2020, 14th August 2020. Let's all remember and work towards making our country as great as it can. So before Kishwar comes on board to deliver her talk, I'm going to request Team NEGD to run a short video that she has brought with her today. Welcome, Kishwar.
चिट्ठियां दर्द दियां 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 लिख सरकारे पाइयां चिट्ठियां दर्द दियां लिख सरकारे पाइयां
शहनशाह सुन वेड़ साडे दुखी दिलां ने पास तू साडे अरज़ान सुनाया
चिट्ठियां दर्द दियां लिख सरकारे पाइयां चिट्ठियां दर्द दियां लिख सरकारे पाइयां
रोलट साहिब जद आया रोलट बिलचा पास कराया
Welcome, Tipper.
Thank you so much, Rupinderji. It's so nice to be on this platform because this truly connects us with the whole of India. And what we require right now, especially just before Independence Day, is to remember the greatness of all our freedom fighters of the past, some of whom were very ordinary men and women, and who died for us, who gave their entire life for us. What you're seeing up now on the screen is a book I wrote, Jallianwala Bagh 1919, The Real Story, because I found that for a long time, almost the past 100 years, you can say, we had been given a particular aspect of history connected to the Jallianwala Bagh. This visual, which you see on screen, is what the Bagh looked like till, I think, last year. Of course, now there are many renovations which are going on around there. But this was the central aspect of it, the flame, which is there to remember all the martyrs. But I do want to say that this was, as you had mentioned earlier, a horrific act. But it was also an act that united the entire country, you know, because in a way, it was only after this terrible massacre that people began to understand that the kind of sacrifices that people were making for independence. So to go back a little bit, let me just talk about what the Bagh looked like. About 100 years ago, when the massacre took place, these are visuals which show you what the Bagh was like. It was actually a barren land. There was nothing there. And it was basically a space where people used to meet. They would come, their cattle would come, their children would play, etc. But it was completely barren. And very interestingly, parts of it were almost 5 feet lower than the ground around it. So there was nothing like what we see today. When we say a Bagh, yes, it was called a Bagh, but actually it was even at that time completely barren land. So I do want to stress upon this, that there are many changes sometimes in history that we do not know about. So it's interesting for us to keep that kind of visual. Nanki, if you can just go a little slow, I'll just tell you when to bring up the next slide, okay? So basically, this is a slide, of course, of, no, I think we'll just go back to Mahatma Gandhi, yes. So this is a visual of Gandhiji when he arrived from Africa. He was actually a very young man at that time. You can say he was not even 50 years old. But the satyagraha that he organized against the Rowlatt Acts, that was something which was really extremely successful. We must remember that even though we do think that the real freedom struggle only began after 13th of April 1919, there were already people who were resisting, especially in Punjab and Bengal. and also in Maharashtra. There were many freedom fighters who were already resisting the colonial rule. And when Gandhiji came back, he took it upon him to therefore go take this forward. And his satyagraha against the Rowlatt Acts was extremely successful. In fact, it united the whole country against colonial rule. And the British got extremely worried about this because they saw for the first time Hindus and Muslims were coming together and they were protesting on the streets. Not only in Punjab, but also in Bombay. And in fact, it was right from, you can say, from Bombay to Burma, because Burma was also part of India at that time. There were street protests, but these were all peaceful. There was nothing at all to, which was like an armed revolt or anything, but it made the British very nervous because they had never seen this kind of open resistance, you can say, to an act which they were bringing in actually to control precisely this. They were trying to ensure that the people, whoever were the freedom fighters, would not be able to come together. And the Rowlatt Act was meant, it said no appeal, no dalil, no vakil, meaning you could not get a lawyer. If they thought that you were the kind of person who was going to work towards destroying what was their colonial rule, they would put you behind bars and you would not have any kind of recourse. Okay, next please. So the Black Bill, as it was called, it was passed, unfortunately in January, but the resistance had taken hold. And I would like to say, next please, that there were many reasons for the kind of resentment that the people were showing at that time, particularly in Punjab. So on the one hand, you had this very draconian act which had come in, but at the same time, you also saw that the Indians were fighting. This is the ironical situation. The Indians were fighting for the British in foreign lands. And the World War I had just taken place. It ended in 1918. So soldiers who were fighting for British freedom abroad came back home to find that their own freedoms were being taken away by this very draconian act. Not only that, there was also increasing inflation because things were scarce, as they always are after a war. And the British were very good at taking away the resources of the Indians at that time so that they could feed their armies. Not only that, there had also been an influenza epidemic which had taken place, and millions of people died during that. So there was already, and let me also state that whilst we are very proud of all our soldiers who fought for freedom, whether it was in World War I or World War II, but a lot of the soldiers were not recruited in a democratic fashion. In fact, they were agents that would go out, especially in Punjab, because the lieutenant governor at that time, Dyer, he believed that the Punjabis were very good at being warriors and soldiers, and he particularly wanted to recruit them by hook or by crook. So he would send out his teams, his agents, and they would sometimes forcibly recruit young men. So therefore, in Punjab, there was also a certain amount of resentment against the British. But I want to stress that even though the Ghadar Party movement was also taking place, if you remember, this was a movement that started abroad in California. And then, of course, the Ghadar Party, freedom fighters also came back to Punjab around that time, making Dyer very, very nervous. But he locked most of them up. So there were all these things that were going on in Punjab. At the same time, this act was like, the last straw, you can say, for most of the people there. However, next slide, please. What was also very interesting, what was happening in Amritsar, and I want to also remind ourselves that this was, pre-independence India. In Amritsar, as in many other places, Hindus, Muslims were in 1919 living peacefully together. So the entire movement in Amritsar was headed by a Hindu, that is Satyapal, whose picture you see here, and by Saifuddin Kichlu. Next, please. And they were very young also. They were barely in their 30s at that time. And they already had organized, satyagrah against the Rowlatt Act in Amritsar extremely successfully. And also what is interesting is many of the meetings had taken place in Jallianwala Bagh and nothing had happened. I mean, because the meetings were peaceful, people were just protesting peacefully. What did satyagrah mean? It meant that you closed down your shop, you stopped doing whatever you were doing on that particular day, and you went on strike, you can say, and you did not do any work for anybody. You just went and attended meetings, or you did a religious fast like Gandhi would encourage, that a sort of a purification thing would take place on that day, etc. So it was all very peaceful, but what was happening as far as the British were concerned, they were getting more and more disconcerted by this, because they had no idea how they were going to handle the, these crowds, large crowds that were gathering all over the place. Now, let us remind ourselves that these crowds were not only gathering in Amritsar, but they were also gathering in Delhi. They were gathering in Mumbai, as I mentioned, at that time, Bombay, in other places, in Ahmedabad. They were gathering there as well, but it was all peaceful. However, they were not able to see this uniting of Hindus and Muslims, because they felt this did not bode well for the British, because if these two communities got together, then they would definitely be able to rebel and thwart the British. Nothing had happened. However, there were a lot of these kind of misconceptions, you can say misunderstandings. And this was particularly what then led to the massacre, because there was a complete disconnect between what the people were doing very peacefully and what the British government, particularly in Punjab under Dyer, who was extremely skeptical of everything that was going on at that time and just wanted that people should not protest. That was his main thing. They should not protest at all. And he disliked Gandhi so much that when Gandhi was coming to Amritsar, and this is just a few days before the massacre took place, he actually had him arrested. Next slide, please. So this is actually a slide of Amritsar at that time. What had happened was that Gandhi was on his way to Amritsar on the 9th, but he was arrested before he could even enter Punjab, and this was on the orders of Dyer. Following that, what happened was that the next day, they decided to arrest Satyapal and Kichlu as well. Now, if you look at this map of Amritsar, you will see that there is a walled city, and basically most of the people of Amritsar lived within that walled city. Even if you visit it here, you'll see it there, that's the old city. And there is a railway bridge. And then when you cross the railway bridge, on the other side was where the British lived in civil lines, in cantonments, large sprawling bungalows, as they had always set up. So on the 10th, when Satyapal and Kichlu were suddenly arrested, the people of Amritsar, who had begun to respect them as their leaders, peaceful leaders, were unable to understand why Gandhi had been arrested before he could enter Punjab, because Gandhi was very keen to address the people in Amritsar, because he could see that the movement was going very well, peaceful, but it was making its point about the Rowlatt Act. So on the 10th morning, when the two leaders in Amritsar, Satyapal and Kichlu, were arrested, they were taken to the DC's office. The DC was a young man at that time, also an extremely nervous Miles Irving, who decided, and he's the one who was giving all this completely dissonant and incorrect information to his superiors, that the people were planning a rebellion. There was no such thing. They just gathered in order to go to his house where Satyapal and Kichlu had been taken, and he wanted, they just wanted to go there and plead for their release. However, this did not happen. And before they could reach, they could cross that railway bridge and they could reach Miles Irving, the DC's house, firing had begun. Soldiers gathered on the orders of the British, and they began firing on this completely defenseless crowd of people. I would not use the word mob, though the British use it a lot when they're describing the events of, because it was a peaceful crowd. They did not have anything. They did not have few people maybe were carrying some sticks or something like that, which they used for walking or whatever purposes, but there were no guns, there were no bombs, there was nothing. They were not even violent. They said, "Hum faryad karne ja rahe," which is that we're going to plead with him. However, they were fired upon, and in the firing, many, maybe over 20, 25, 30. I want to quickly add that the sadness of this entire story of Jallianwala Bagh is that we never know exactly and precisely how many people were actually killed, because the British never bothered to find out. However, the crowd got very restless and naturally angry, because there were 25 to 30 people who were killed. And since many rounds were fired, many people were also injured. So they took the injured away, but at that moment, the crowd began to get angry, and they burnt down a few buildings which belonged to the British. And they also, in that anger and in that moment, tried to take some revenge for all the people that had been killed of theirs. And unfortunately, 5 British men were killed. And because of that, suddenly the atmosphere changed further as far as the British were concerned. The Indians on their part were very disheartened by what had happened that day, because this kind of incident had never taken place in the walled city of Amritsar earlier. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the gate. This is Hall Gate as we know it now. So this is the gate where a lot of the confrontation had taken place. And if you look inside, that is Hall Bazaar, where a lot of you may have gone to do your shopping, etc. That's a very historic street as far as Jallianwala Bagh is concerned, because that is where the people were pushed back and they began to riot in the confusion that was taking place. And the buildings that were burnt are all inside. If you go down Hall Bazaar and you walk towards Town Hall, where our museum, the Partition Museum, is, in fact, there was a police chowki there that was burnt. There was a post office there that was burnt, etc. So there was a lot of mayhem which was taking place. However, by the afternoon, next slide, please. This is the town hall where our Partition Museum is at the moment. This was also burnt down on that day. And incidentally, this is the photograph that intrigued me and made me want to write this book, because I had no idea why the place in which we had the museum had been burnt down. And I wanted to find out what had happened. So then I realized that this was actually dated 10th of April. It was not 13th of April. And on the 10th of April, already a massacre had taken place. And most of the people who were dead, 25, 30, whose names we still do not know till today, were all martyred, and they were all Indians. Okay, next, please. Okay, so now we start moving towards the next part of our story, which is the entry of whom we know as General Dyer. Please do not mix him with Dyer, because a lot of people make that mistake. They think it was Dyer who was really who led the massacre, but it was not. It was this person who was at that point the General Dyer, who was at that point based in Jalandhar. Now, he had nothing actually to do with Amritsar. He was based there. He was a pretty middling kind of an officer, not even extremely well known in the British ranks. He was not very, he did not get promoted as much as though he had a title of a brigadier general, but this was a temporary title. He was actually a colonel, which we do not refer to him as of now when we read history books, but he was not higher than the rank of a lieutenant colonel. However, he was called a general because it was a temporary rank. And anyhow, he then claims that because the British were now looking at somehow suppressing what they thought was another round of rioting. However, nothing had happened. There was an incident on the 10th. The 11th and 12th, I want to stress, were completely peaceful. Still, Dyer claimed later on that he received a phone call and he was told to come to Amritsar to quell the riots. Now, I want to also say one more thing, that by this time, Amritsar already had a lot of soldiers on the street, because from Lahore, the police commissioner had come down, the commissioner had come down, they had driven down, and they somehow felt that they had to avenge the death of the 5 British men who had been killed. There was no talk at all of the, 25, 30 Indians who had died and the run up to that. And they were also very distressed because one lady had been molested. So, in a sense that the rioting crowds had accosted her in a street in Amritsar. Her name was Massacre Sherwood. She was a missionary working there and she was cycling home. But when the crowds were running away from the bullets of the British, they ran down one street, they saw her and apparently attacked her, but she was rescued by some Indians who lived in that street. But however, this event was blown out of proportion by the British because they felt that if the Indians could raise their eyes even towards a English woman, if they could begin to kill Englishmen, then they needed to be suppressed and suppressed most brutally. So here we have what I have tried to point out in my book, literally a conspiracy. This was not a spontaneous firing which took place in Jallianwala Bagh on the 13th, because I want to point out to you, 11th is peaceful, 12th is peaceful, nothing happens except on the 11th night of April, there is the arrival of General Dyer in Amritsar. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we are already looking at the Bagh in the aftermath of the massacre. This is what the slide shows us. But I would just like to trace my steps a little bit and tell you that when General Dyer arrives in Amritsar, on the 12th morning itself, he takes out a flag march. He goes around the city. He tries to impress upon the people that he is here and now no one dare say anything about the British or even the Rowlatt Act or do anything. So it was almost a military takeover, you can say, of Amritsar, because the civilian administration totally withdrew. The DC was quite happy to give up everything. He was already a very nervous man. He was expecting all kinds of further confrontations, especially after the 10th. Though he could see that nothing was happening, but things were now moving very rapidly. And Dyer, who was sitting in Lahore, was constantly trying to monitor the situation and saying that we have to somehow control what was going on in Amritsar. Actually, nothing much was going on. People were very distressed because so many of their own had been killed, but that was regardless. So Dyer, in Dyer's biography, which was published after his death, it says very clearly that as he went around the streets of Amritsar, he could see only narrow lanes. And that for him was not good enough, because if he did any firing or if he tried to take advantage of the situation, he would not be able to kill many people. So when he saw or he heard, he didn't actually go. So I would correct myself. When he was told probably about Jallianwala Bagh, he realized that this was a perfect situation. Now, why I say that he probably knew about Jallianwala Bagh, because whatever we might say about Dyer and his incompetence in many other matters, he was a military man. And he was not going to go around the city without creating a plan in his mind on how he was going to suppress the people of Amritsar and how he was going to ensure that they would never, which was what his orders were, rebel again. So despite the fact that they knew, because, he took out a procession even on the morning of the 13th. He went in a procession which apparently was announcing that all meetings were banned. But quite cleverly, the procession never went anywhere near the Golden Temple, which Dyer was taking out, and the people who were carrying the message was taking out. They never went close to the Jallianwala Bagh. Now, this is quite strange because Jallianwala Bagh is not very far from the police chowki I spoke about earlier, which was burned down, but where there were still policemen who were posted there. So if a meeting was going to be banned, they should have also made sure that some kind of police men were posted stopping people from going into Jallianwala Bagh, because let me stress again, this was a place where meetings were routinely held. And yes, it was Baisakhi Day, but I do want to also point out that this was not already a normal Vaisakhi, because we have eyewitness accounts which talk about the fact that people who visited Amritsar even on the 10th noticed that there were buildings that were smoldering, noticed that there were deserted streets. These were Indians who were visiting, or they were coming home from outside. And they had a very tough time even entering the walled city because there were soldiers already parked everywhere. So this was a carefully thought out military operation. Now, what had also been provided for very helpfully by Dyer was an aircraft. Now, already on the 12th, some eyewitness accounts are there which say that there was talk of bombing Amritsar. And the person who reports this says that he probably managed to stop the bombing by telling the officials that if you bomb Amritsar and you bomb the Golden Temple, you will lose every soldier, every Sikh soldier you have in the army today. You know, it would have a huge impact. So there was already an idea that you could suppress the people through using military means. So when people started gathering at Jallianwala Bagh, now there is also another stream of thought that says that this was, even the meeting was organized by the British, because there were some spies which they had which could do such a thing. But let us only focus on the fact that the people were very upset with what had happened on the 10th of April, and they genuinely wanted to go, and they still believed. If you look at, which I have written in my book, if you look at the kind of notices which they put out to other people, to their own people in Amritsar, these notices about the meeting state that we must plead with the British to release Satyapal and Kichlu. We must request them to take away the Rowlatt Act. So they were still in the stage where they wanted to negotiate. However, on that day, as now we know historically, the meeting takes place. And I also want to state here that largely it was not actually so many people who had come for the Baisakhi Mela, because I do want to stress it was impossible for people to enter into Amritsar. And even Jallianwala Bagh, whoever went there after the events of the 10th were well aware that this kind of thing could happen again, firing could. So they were actually very brave. Whoever went and attended that meeting was already aware that a similar thing could happen. However, and another significant fact is that there were hardly any women present. We have this visual in our mind of, from, I think, that film which was made on Gandhi, that, the people were jumping into the well, but actually people did not jump into the well. When the firing began, there was a well, but it didn't have a rim. So when people were running away from it, they accidentally fell into the well because they were trying to escape. So this was a closed, as we all know, Jallianwala Bagh has got surrounded by walls. The visual here shows you people at that time. Unfortunately, a lot of this has been covered by plants and bushes and things like that. And I do hope in the renovation taking place, a lot of these things will be revealed, because the people here are pointing out at the bullet holes. So you can see that the bullet holes go quite high because people were trying to scramble up the wall. So what happened on that day? Dyer waits for people to gather. An aircraft, so this is very important, an aircraft flies overhead at precisely around 4:30 or 5, and obviously signals to Dyer that enough people have now gathered at Jallianwala Bagh. Then he is staying in Rambagh, which is not very far away from this, and he comes down in 2 armored vehicles plus soldiers and so on, comes in and begins to fire. And as we also know, that he fires on defenseless people again, almost 1,650 rounds, and which means it's almost 33 rounds. Now, round is a bullet, which is why we discovered when we were doing this research, I was helped here by the Partition Museum team, because this entire story just kept expanding and expanding, and there was so much that we needed to gather information on. What we discovered was that the figure that had been given of 379, in fact, on that very day, that very night, when Dyer sends his first message to Lahore about the confrontation, or so-called, that he had that had taken place, because it was very one-sided, he fires bullets into this defenseless crowd. People start running. Most of the bullet injuries, and it makes you cry, when you read about it, are at the back of the legs, in the soles of the feet, many young children. One eyewitness account says almost 500 young children, but these were, I want to stress again, mostly boys. Very few women, like I said, because already a confrontation had taken place on the 10th. People were not going to risk their women going here. They were only in when we went through the head count of the dead bodies, and we were also lucky that we found a file which dated back to that time, which had been maintained by the DC during our research, and we were able to do a comparison with people who asked for compensation, etc. I won't go into the detail, but we did a lot of almost 6 months of research, and we discovered there were only two bodies of women which were found. And in that kind of a massacre where probably over 1,000 people were killed. Now, why do we say that it was 379? Because the head count was not taken immediately. The head count was taken much later, almost 3 months later, and by which time, Amritsar was devastated. It had already been destroyed by this massacre, and it was devastated further by the martial law, which I will come to in a bit, which was then imposed upon Amritsar, where people were humiliated, they were whipped, they were caged, they were jailed, they were starved, they were beaten. I mean, you cannot think of the kind of atrocities that were committed on the people of Amritsar. And it was not just Dyer, it was many of his men who were also doing this. So what happened on that day was, on the 13th, you have this huge massacre that takes place. And I would beg to submit that over 1,000 people were killed. Even in our own research, when we were literally doing a head count of everything, we came up with a figure of 547. And we really worked hard on this. And all the exhibitions we did on Jallianwala Bagh, we actually gave all the cross-checked and double cross-checked and triple cross-checked names, because unfortunately, in many places that we saw where the memorials are there, we found there were spelling mistakes and, sort of. Anyway, we did our best, and we've got that list out there now. And the main thing which I want to stress is that Dyer did not provide any hospital, help to anyone. In fact, when the injured went to the civil hospital, which was run by another very brutal doctor called Colonel Smith, he told them, he called them dogs, all the injured that came, and said, please go, he didn't use the word please, I'm sure, he said, just go away, get yourself treated by Gandhi or somebody like that, do not come here. So it was the local doctors who were extremely, the Indians, who took on those hundreds and hundreds of cases and literally worked through the night trying to save some of the wounded. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here we come to a very sad story. This, of course, is one of the young boys who was martyred. His name is Madan Mohan. He was just 13 years old. He had actually gone there to play, and his house was, his house faces, it is on the wall of Jallianwala Bagh. So actually, he died, and his father found his body buried under many corpses. It was one of the most tragic stories. So he is one of the youngest named martyrs, though they were babies who were killed, who were just months old. As I said, mostly all men, all male children. So Amritsar was completely devastated. Next, please. Okay, so when we say that there was almost immediately after that, instead of providing any kind of help to the people, instead of saying, okay, we need to help you because you have now suffered so much. We have massacred hundreds and hundreds of you. Now we need to stop and we need to see what is going on. Instead of that, what the British did, especially under General Dyer, he was still there. He didn't stay there for very long, but whatever time he was there, he ensured that there was complete repression of the people of Amritsar. So this is the street where, as I had mentioned before, Marcia Sherwood, the woman, who was a missionary, had been attacked by a crowd that was running away from the bullets of the British. And she was saved, actually, and she went back to England as well. But it became a huge cause celebre by everybody reported that case. And Dyer decided to make an example of that case. and ensure that the people who lived on that street would never forget what happened to Marcia Sherwood. This was bizarre, because the people who lived in that street had nothing to do with what happened, because she was attacked by this crowd that came running down. However, what he did was he sealed off the street, Gully Jallianwala. If you go to Amritsar, we have recently been putting up plaques in Amritsar trying to identify various places that were associated with Jallianwala Bagh. So this is one street that we have identified to put the plaque, because people don't know where it is. And so this street, the General Dyer said this was a complete brainwave. He called it a brainwave that he had, that he was going to make people crawl down the street. Nobody was going to be allowed to walk. So everybody who was a householder on the street had to crawl. And this was a normal crawling. This was not like on your fours. This was on your belly. And this street, I don't know if any one of you has visited it recently, but it is unfortunately very, very narrow, and it is not at all, even in those days, there were mounds of rubbish which were lying around at that time. And so people had to crawl. These were respectable men, because the women were all locked up inside the house. So unfortunately, in the street, people starved. For almost the 8 to 10 days that this order had been imposed on the street, they just starved, because they were too humiliated to go out. They couldn't go out because the soldiers were outside, and they would be whipped. So these photographs actually were all taken by British soldiers, I'm sure very proudly, to show what they had been doing in Amritsar. And so people were forced to crawl. They were not able to enter into that street. And we have eyewitness accounts. Again, you'll see them in my book and also in the various exhibitions that we have been doing, of little children who again starved to death on that street. And one child who died of fear. She was so scared. Her mother says she just died of fear, because the soldiers would even go to the extent of getting killing the pigeons. In India, you look after animals. So there was a pigeon coop there, and they started shooting all the pigeons there and barbecuing them on the doorstep of the householders who lived there. So the women were terrified, and this little child told her mother that, "Mother, they have killed the pigeons, now they're going to kill me." And this was out of sheer fear she died. So there are many, many such stories. Next, please. Okay, so this is what is called a tiktiki. Now, this was something which we recreated from the photographs for the exhibitions that we do to show what happened at Jallianwala Bagh. Now, this was a very typical sort of frame on which people were tied in order to be whipped in public. So this is a tiktiki, which is very much reflects the kind, it's a triangle, and the people were tied on with chains, and then they were very brutally whipped. And this happened in the middle of the street of Gully Jallianwala. And the women would be terrified because they were locked up inside, and they still remember the screams of the young people who had nothing to do with the attack that had taken place on Sherwood, and yet they were whipped. And there's one particular young boy who is whipped so brutally he faints, and then he's given water, revived, and then again whipped. And there are eyewitness accounts of how these young men, who had nothing to do with the event that took place, but it was Dyer's thinking that everybody was responsible for this and everyone should learn this lesson. Okay, next please. Okay, so you have these bizarre, as I said, martial law orders which were passed everywhere in Amritsar and also in all of Punjab. Now, this is martial law notice number 21. Believe me, it took us a lot of time to find out, dig out these martial law notices. I had to go to London and take them out of a library there. It's not easy to find these things. And this was issued by Frank Johnson, who was also a lieutenant colonel, who was posted, a very equally brutal, as you find Dyer, he was equally brutal. He decided to take away all the cycles. There was no reason for this, but they just decided that they were going to humiliate the middle class, particularly because it was the middle class at that point that was, organizing these protests against the Rowlatt Act. All the professionals, the lawyers, the doctors, etc. So they wanted to, and also the people who are in the lower rungs, the lower middle class, that was also coming up at that time, who owned cycles. So the cars were confiscated, the cycles were even the fans were taken away. It was very hot. Please remember, this was happening in April. It was extremely hot, but they would take away, they cut off the electricity. I mean, when Dyer arrives, he cuts off the electricity, he cuts off the water. So you have people, a massacre, people are bleeding on the streets, but there is no water apparently around to kind of give them, any kind of succor. And a lot of people in Jallianwala Bagh, because when you're bleeding so profusely from many wounds, you're crying out for water. And eyewitness accounts say how almost the whole night they heard all people crying for water, lying there. Because martial law was also imposed, but there was a curfew that was in place, that nobody could step out after 8 o'clock. So you could not step out, which meant that all the people in the Bagh could not be rescued by many of their relatives because of the curfew that was imposed at 8 o'clock after the massacre was over. And of course, from the next day onwards, all these martial laws took place. So they were imposed not just in Amritsar. The martial law orders were imposed almost all over Punjab. So we must remember that there had been confrontations, similar nature. Of course, nothing became as violent as in Amritsar, because in Amritsar, 5 Englishmen had died. And we must remember that, because that was the main reason. However, all the thousands of Indians who were killed, who were injured, unfortunately, their names were never given out. And that's why I come to the conclusion of when we were counting the corpses, that because the counting took place only in August, by which time martial law orders had also been in place, a lot of people had simply died, because they were also locked up in jail at that time. And there were many things which were happening. They died of their wounds. They were not given proper, care in the hospitals, etc. So the count of Jallianwala Bagh is far, far higher. Next, please. Okay, so then we come to another, some very strange things which were also taking place. Not only did we have this massacre which had taken place in Amritsar, not only did we have the imposition of martial law orders, but in certain cities such as Gujranwala, which was actually a very small town at that time, and it was of course part of undivided India, which is why I say things were happening in Lahore, things were happening in Gujranwala, things were happening in Kasur, but almost uniformly everywhere in Punjab. And I want to stress this because there was also confrontation which had happened in Delhi, which had got amicably resolved. There was also major confrontation which took place in Ahmedabad, but there the authorities were wise enough to call Gandhi and to help, smooth over things. And so nothing happened there. Even in Bombay, people were wise and they allowed a kind of a dialogue to take place. And, so even though there was a confrontation, but the administration there did not allow it to get out of hand. However, in Dyer's case, he wanted to punish the people of Punjab because he disliked the Gaddarites. He thought the Gaddarites were creating a lot of problems for him in Punjab because they kept returning. This was, of course, as I said, the start of the freedom struggle, which was already nascent in Bengal, in Punjab, in Maharashtra, and people were already beginning to show signs of restlessness. And therefore, Dyer thought nothing of bombing people in Gujranwala when they also, so this is one of the victims that you see here who was injured in the bombing which took place because I think his thumb and lower jaw was shattered by the bombing that took place in Gujarat. Now, how do we have all these photographs? These photographs are with us because Gandhi ji conducted very wisely a thorough inquiry after the event that took place in Jallianwala Bagh, and when the martial law orders were lifted 3 months later, and they were able to get these witnesses to come forward and say what exactly had happened. So Gujranwala was bombed through these aircraft that was going, which is unheard of. No administration ever bombs its own people. It was like shocking, but they did it. Next, please. Okay, so here we come to, again, this is a map of Amritsar city. And again, I think some of the events that I have already described have taken place in this area in Amritsar itself. And there was a lot of brutal repression after that. Okay, next, please. Right, now this is Lord Hunter. So what happens is that after all this has happened, nobody takes any notice because the press has been censored in Punjab. Most of the editors, including that of the Tribune, have all been locked up. No lawyer is allowed to enter Punjab. They're very clever. They decide that no lawyer, because they know that Gandhiji is a lawyer. Pandit Nehru, his father was Motilal Nehru, was a well-known lawyer at that time, etc. So they said that no lawyers are allowed to, so that people could not get any justice. However, thousands and thousands of Punjabis are rounded up, and this, I'm not talking only about Amritsar, but I'm talking about at other places. They're wounded, they're whipped publicly, and they're rounded up in many ways. So when martial law is finally lifted around 2.5, 3 months later, this whole thing explodes because already people are beginning to worry what is happening in Punjab. And finally, the British government is forced to hold an inquiry of their own. Okay, so an inquiry of their own, and they put Lord Hunter in charge of that particular inquiry. This is the gentleman, and of course we have we know that he had to put forth many of the arguments that came out from that. He had to put them forth in the public domain, but shockingly, many parts of the reports were also suppressed for decades. And I would say till as late as 1960, Indian historians did not have easy access to what exactly had happened in Jallianwala Bagh, in Amritsar, in Punjab. And even when I was writing my book, I had to literally go through all the evidence that had been recorded at that time, line by line, to try and understand what had happened, because there was so much covered up. There was just so much covered up. So therefore you have this inquiry that takes place, but what comes out of the inquiry is one part which is put in the public domain and one which is suppressed. Sorry, am I out of time? Hello?
How many more slides, Kishore?
I think there are another 10. So should I just wind up now? I'll just give a quick...
You have about 7 more minutes. So however
okay.
you would like to.
So I will go very quickly through the rest. Okay, next, please. Next slide.
This is the end. This is the end.
Oh, this is the end. Okay, because it says 12. So I was just thinking about
okay.
Okay, so that's it. So we've timed it rather well, and I think so we can. Well, we do have Churchill and so on. I mean, then you know the idea just the whole debate then shifts to London, because there is a public inquiry which is held, and there is also debates in Parliament, in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords. But unfortunately, I won't go into all the details, but unfortunately, Dyer is given a lot of sympathy by the British press. And in fact, almost £26,000 are raised for him, because by that time, the Secretary of India at that time, Montagu, realizes that a terrible incident. He was actually an India sympathizer. He claims he did not know many of the details of what had happened exactly in Amritsar. So he then decides that he has to be censored. And what happens to Dyer is that he has to resign from the army, and then goes away to lead a very quiet life till he dies ultimately. And of course, we know that Churchill also condemned what happens. Churchill was not an India sympathizer, but he also realized that things could go very much out of hand, because by now he understands that there is a growing feeling that what happened was completely out of anybody's imagination. Worst things could, the worst thing that could have happened in Punjab, and this could actually inflame passions and lead to the freedom struggle, which in any case it did. I also want to point out that our leaders, who till that point had been quite okay with negotiating with the British and trying to find a way forward, now suddenly, especially Gandhi and Nehru and even non-political leaders such as Rabindranath Tagore and so on, now realized that enough was enough. They could no longer have anything to do with the British after Jallianwala Bagh happened. And that is how, when Gandhi returned his medals, when Rabindranath ji returned his knighthood, and other leaders started coming together and talking about what had happened in Jallianwala Bagh, that is how the people of India and indeed the world realized that the terrible events that had taken place there could not ever be forgiven. And that's how we finally come to the beginning of the freedom struggle. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Kishore. That has been a poignant journey of last, I think, 55 minutes. And I'm sure anyone who's watching it could not have been left unaffected. And looking at the kind of massacre that happened, looking at a child as young as 13 and children even younger than that, gunned down for what? I think it raises so many questions. That it was a watershed moment for the Indian independence movement is one part of the story, but it also reminds us that how low can humanity stoop to? And there is learning. There is learning after 101 years out of such events and incidents. And that's why history must be visited, because history teaches us so much, so much. But Kishore, I at this point would also like to share with the viewers, because we are in the holy land of Amritsar, a land that has shown so much resilience, a land that has been visited many a time by marauders, people who were just interested in looting and plundering. Of one of the hymns I just mentioned, De Shiva bar mohe he, Shubh karman te kabhu na taru, na daro na arso, jab jaye lado, nischay kar apni jeet karo. O Shiva, Shiva here is the feminine form of Shiv, the Shakti. Grant me this boon that I may never stray from doing good deeds. Last time when we were mentioning about the war museums in India, I had mentioned Jaisalmer, and Jaisalmer at the Longewala post has a war museum set up by the Indian Army. And over there is a milestone on which are inscribed these words, Nischay kar apni jeet karo. These are important sentiments, viewers, and when we bring to you this series of webinars coming tomorrow to the conclusion of this set of webinars, it evokes in us very different sentiments. There is pride, there is sadness, there is a sense of loss for all those who lost their lives. But then at the end, you're still left very proud and so very, what should I say? I think it brings in you a sense that if people could actually lay down their lives, physically go down, we must stand together and join hands and make our great nation Atmanirbhar. We have to be strong. We have to progress further from this point. Moving slightly to a different tone, because I would like all of us to celebrate this moment. We need to celebrate the martyrdom of all those who lost their lives. Is to remind all of you that when you are in Amritsar, incidentally, how do you get to Amritsar? There is an airport at Amritsar. There is an airport in New Delhi from where you can take a 55-minute flight. There are many flight options. There is, of course, a wonderful Shatabdi train that connects you from Delhi. Amritsar also gets international flights from different countries. So there are many ways to get there. So do definitely visit Jallianwala Bagh and remember the lives that were lost there. But also go and visit and take the blessings of the Lord at Harmandir Sahib. Do also go to the Wagah border ceremony. where the ceremony happens is a place I feel, I have visited myself there, that you will get a different sense of what it is to belong to the motherland.
Can I quickly add, also
Please
go to
do.
the Partition Museum, because
Yes,
that is
I
where
was
you
going to
get.
mention that do not
Okay.
miss the Partition Museum. But when you go to the Hall Bazaar, do not also miss the amazing food that is served in the dhabas. Some of the dhabas have been there for almost a century now. So, so do not miss eating the makke di roti, sarson da saag, the bharta and the maki dal and what all that comes from there. Do also seek the blessings of Ma from the Mandir Mata Lal Devi. There is a Govindgarh Fort, there is a Mata Durgiana Mandir. And I'm going to call in Ms. Bharti Sharma, the assistant DG with us at this point, to tell us what is the Ministry of Tourism doing in Amritsar to make the experience even better for all of you. Bharti?
Yeah, good morning. So as far as Ministry of Tourism is concerned, there are different verticals on which Ministry is working. One of the verticals that we are working is of providing a better infrastructure, better facilities to the tourists, and to give them more better experience when they visit these sites. So we have different schemes under which we are developing this infrastructure. So we are doing one very important project for restoration, renovation of Jallianwala Bagh. We are doing it with ASI. So the kind of facilities we are doing, basically we are restoring the memorial, we are coming with the sound and light show, we are doing a site museum which ASI is developing, and this project is almost complete. Another month it is expected to complete. So next time when you're going, is going to be a very different experience. So do visit this site when you're there. Next, thank you.
So again, just a point here, a lot of this research we have shared with the museum that is coming up in Jallianwala Bagh. So it gives us, as a small NGO, a lot of happiness and pride that we are being able to do something to honor the martyrs of Jallianwala Bagh. So we've given most of this research to them.
Kishore, one question which was asked right in the beginning, and I think we have a minute or two, so we quickly take that, is that the restoration work that is being done around the Jallianwala Bagh and making it into a memorial, is it in any way taking away from the spirit of the place, or how are we making sure that we conserve the deep sense that must be there because of the kind of intense incident that this place shall always be known for?
Yes, yeah, I think there were concerns. Sorry, there are two ways to handle this. One is to be politically correct and say, no, everything is fine. But certainly in the past, I haven't been able to go there and see what is happening right now. But certainly in the past, a lot of people who went there, of course, they were very moved. But because the whole thing had been changed, it had become literally a green bark. And that undulating land, that barren land, that the site of spaces, but was very restricted. So I do hope, and I would really highly recommend, if that was still to be maintained, it could definitely bring back the spirit of what had happened on 13th of April, 101 years ago.
Somebody asked you to mention Sir Udham Singh. Would you like to mention him in?
Yes. Yes, I did. I did want to. Then I realized I'm really seriously running out of time. Udham Singh, there is a debate whether, I think no historian has come to any conclusion whether he was actually there on that day or not, but certainly he was very affected by it. Bhagat Singh, they say, was there, went there later, and he picked up the matti. He was not there on that day, but he picked up the matti and swore that he would go for, try and get independence for India. Udham Singh was very impacted by it, and as you know, he spent many years in England trying to track down Dyer, and finally did kill him, finally did shoot him dead. So he was, he's been a slightly mysterious figure all these years, because, he being a revolutionary, in those days, no revolutionary could openly sort of say what he was doing. So he was quietly training himself, getting himself ready for that moment. So he actually took what many people believe was a kind of revenge for everything that happened, not only in Amritsar, but indeed the whole of Punjab, because in many ways, Dyer was the mastermind, Dyer was the executor, but he was already dead by the time Udham Singh took Dyer's life.
Thank you, Kishore. Well, viewers,
Thank you.
many questions coming in, but we are definitely running already out of time, in fact. And we can only at this point say and pray for peace, peace for the whole world. We come from the land of the Mahatma. We come from the land of non-violence, and we want to definitely espouse that cause. But yes, we also say at the same time, Nishchay kar apni jeet karo. None of us, Kishore, is left, as I already said, unaffected. I'm sure it has stirred very different feelings in all of us today. Well, ending today's webinar and taking all of you tomorrow to the historic day of 15th August 2020, we shall take you to the land of another towering figure of that entire independence movement. Can you guess when I say the towering figure? Well, that's the tallest statue of the world, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, a little out of Ahmedabad, is the Statue of Unity. But more than just going to the Statue of Unity, we are going to see how crucial, how critical was the role of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel in this entire journey that we witnessed for more than 100 years in becoming independent. But then, as somebody said the other day, is it just enough to be independent? Was it enough to call the clarion call and be independent? No. If we did not have Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, viewers, we would not be the India the way we are today. But then, as a tribute to all the contributions done by these towering figures, it is our bounden duty to our motherland to make it the great country that it is. So ending today's webinar, thanking Kishore for very, very valuable inputs. Keep joining us in the Dekho Apna Desh webinars. Tomorrow at the same time that we always do, 11 a.m., we are going to take you to the journey of that towering figure, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Do tune in, join us at 11 a.m., and let's also definitely rise tomorrow to our great land. Namaste. Thank you for joining in.